everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your taking the time to come and learn a little bit about the Global Water Security Center and who we are and what you do. Today's talk is called Wrangling Insight from Chaos, How GWSC is Changing the Water Security Landscape. GWSC is here at the University of Alabama, and we're dedicated to translating water science for environmental security. Our aim is to serve as a bridge between scientists and key government, intelligence, and defense officials who are making decisions that are right at the intersection of water, health, food, and energy. If you want to learn more about us, we do have a website. It's ua-gwsc.org. And what we're going to do today is hopefully answer some of those questions. So we'll start out by talking a little bit about the history of GWSC. We'll talk about the kinds of work we do, how we gather information, and then we'll dive into a more detailed look at a couple of the analytic products that we make. As we start our webinar, please feel free to submit questions at any time via the Q&A. We have about 20 minutes at the end for dedicated question and answer. And we're really excited to know what you want to know and to answer those questions. We are also recording this webinar and we'll make it available on our website and our social media platforms. So with that, I want to introduce my colleagues who will be talking together today about the work that GWSC does. So joining me today are Penny Beames and Nicholas Roberge. And we're here to talk about the work we do and how it is that we do the work of GWSC. So to kick that off, my name is Kate Brauman. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Global Water Security Center. I come to GWSC from a history of working with all kinds of global hydrologic data, thinking about ecosystem services and land management. I was at the University of Minnesota for about 10 years before I was here at the University of Alabama. And in between, I had a really amazing opportunity through a AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellowship to work at the Department of Defense. And through all of that, I've become more and more passionate about not just understanding water, but making sure that other folks can understand water as well. And so I'm really excited to be here today to talk with Penny and Nick about what it is that GWSC does. So Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Nick Roberge. I'm the lead geospatial intelligence analyst here. And my background is in military intelligence. I did 6 years as an intelligence analyst in the Air Force, and a lot of that was spent as an imagery analyst, and I planned airborne reconnaissance missions. And I also worked at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in East Asia maritime security, looking at satellite imagery. And then most recently, I did an internship at NASA through their DEVELOP program, looking at satellite data to assess damage from a hurricane at a state park in Florida. So, and I did, my bachelor's was in international relations, and then I did a master's in GIS development, geographic information systems. And now I work in data analysis, cartography, and I compile all the information to create our final reports that we make.
Fantastic. Penny, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my name's Penny Beames, and I am based out of Victoria, BC in Canada. I am one of the human environment analysts on the team, but my unofficial title is story wrangler, because it's my job to look into everything that's going on in a particular region that we may have been asked about and figure out, like, what is the key story? What are the key elements of what's happening on the ground that people really need to know about? And it can very much feel like a lasso trying to wrangle everything together. But it turns out that my very unorthodox academic and professional background comes in handy for this kind of task. So I have a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature, and then branched off into water after that. And so I have a master's in environmental studies from York University in Canada on how countries share rivers that cross their borders. And then I went and worked in Asia for a little while on hydropower in the Mekong. Then I went and did another master's because I'm a glutton for punishment. So I have a master's of science in geography, where most of my focus was on the ways that dams affect human and non-human systems. And then now I find myself here with the GWSC.
So as you can tell, we're a diverse group, and bringing this really wide set of skills to bear. I want to start out by talking a little bit about what the Global Water Security Center is and why the Global Water Security Center is, and then we'll use that to really launch this conversation about what it is that GWSC does. So, like I said, I'm the deputy director here. The director is Mike Gramillion, and Mike retired from Air Force Weather as a colonel after 27 years in the military, and he likes to say that this center in many ways grows out of the kind of scars and bruises that he got in the military when he was showing up, everywhere from the Situation Room at the White House to the State Department, throughout the Pentagon, and responding to people who were asking him questions about water and the environment and science, because he was the weather guy with a security clearance. And what he really walked away from that with was frustration, because he knew, and we know, that there's so much amazing data and science that's out in the world that's being developed by government agencies, that's also being developed in academia, that if you're in the research world, you know about, you use, you can really make use of. But when you're sitting in a decision-making chair, you often don't even know that that information exists. You're not reading the papers, the cutting edge, and you probably don't have the capacity to do the sort of data analysis that's necessary to answer your questions, even if the raw information is available. And so I had, in a really sort of alternate pathway, been coming to a similar conclusion that Mike was. So he was sitting in the decision maker chair and thinking, there has to be a way to get this data into my office. I was sitting in an academic position, and I am totally guilty of writing that paper that says, this is very decision relevant science. And I can almost assure you that there is not a decision maker who has read that paper. And so doing the translation, answering the questions, getting the specific information to the right people is really what the mission of this center is, that we're based on the deeply, deeply held belief that better water and environmental information can help decision makers in the intelligence community make better decisions. And we got to get that information to them in order to help make that happen, to make, national security safer, more secure. And so what the Global Water Security Center is, we're funded by the Department of Defense. And so the Department of Defense is really who our client is. When DoD interests overlap with whole of government, then we're working with whole of government to provide and produce materials that synthesize water and environmental issues for those decision makers. And so what we're doing is multifaceted. We are working with decision makers themselves to try to understand, well, what decisions are you making? What information do we need to bring to you? And then also looking out into the science and research world that's all around us to say, what's known about that? What's actually going on? So my role at the Global Water Security Center as the deputy director is really to be at the center of the chaos, and it's lots of fun. So the best parts of my day are when I get to work with Penny and Nick as we think about, how do we put these products together? And so I'm doing a lot of the interfacing with the folks who are reaching out to us, who are requesting information from us to try to figure out, okay, what do you actually need? What do we want to get out of this? What do we think the bottom line is here? What's the right question to ask of the science so that we can translate it back for these users? But we get lots of questions. And this really does take a team, and it takes this wide range of skill sets that you see here in front of you on this webinar. And our team has grown and is continuing to grow. So that's really exciting. But I want to turn this over to Penny to talk a little bit about her job. So Penny, you mentioned that the way you describe your job is as a story wrangler. So what does that mean? What do you do?
Well, I try to make as much sense as possible out of a wide variety of details. Probably how to sum it up in one sentence. So when a quick look request comes in, or some sort of request for information, rapid assessment, the client will normally have a couple of notes about what they want to see. Like maybe they're really interested in how climate is going to affect food security, or how El Nino might affect floods or disasters or hydropower. So I take those couple of notes that we've gotten from the client and I start to dig into the literature. So if it's about a particular region, I'm looking at the news, I'm looking at academic articles, I'm looking at gray literature by the World Bank or like ADB if we're working in Southeast Asia. And so I try to find any sort of written information about what it is we're trying to tackle. Because one of the first important questions we have to answer is, have the research and science been done to even answer the question the client has asked? And sometimes the answer to that is no. We can get very close, but sometimes we're asking, like the client is asking for things that science just hasn't caught up with yet, but can help direct where that science will go. So then once I have all of that literature, and I've started to build like a mental model of what's happening on the ground in this place, I go to the data science geospatial people and I ask for the data that they have on the same topic, the same region, to see if the data that we have can corroborate what I'm finding in the literature. Oftentimes the data can, and other times the data will completely upend my assumptions, which is actually pretty exciting. It's pretty interesting when that happens, because it means that there's a line of inquiry that we haven't really seen yet. And so that often opens up a whole other literature rabbit hole.
Wait, do I get to interrupt here to mention that?
Yeah, sure.
Sometimes I think of my job as being a magician because I get to pull story wranglers out of rabbit holes.
Our job is to get into the rabbit holes, and Kate's job is to pull us back out. Yeah, and like the geospatial and the data people are also very good for pulling us out, because the pull up is like, hey, we don't have the data for these. Like, these questions are brilliant, and in 25 years, we might have an answer for you. So yeah, and then we work with the geospatial folks, the data science, to figure out what kind of maps, graphs, visual cues we can use to help tell the story. And then it's like, once we have all of those things in motion, I try my best to synthesize what's going on in one sentence, which is incredibly difficult. But from that one sentence, if we use that as our guiding star, then we can assemble, like we can assemble climate data, we can assemble weather forecasts, we can assemble crop maps, and everything that we put together is just in support of that one sentence, that one top line that a client or a decision maker has asked for, and they need it like that.
So Penny, you mentioned that then you want data and you really need maps. So I want to turn to Nick to hear a little bit more about what you're doing as a geospatial intelligence analyst.
Sure. And yeah, Penny mentioned a lot of the kind of stuff that I work on in collaboration with her. And early on, I was the very first analyst brought on board here. So I did all of everything, I guess. And then part of that was also developing some of the scripts we use to pull data and form the data in a way that we can utilize it. So I've been kind of the gatekeeper of the scripts and being able to pull that data that we were using in the past for the projects that we're currently working on. So that's a big part of what I do, is just getting data and manipulating it into something we can use, and then trying to visualize everything that Penny is trying to say in these quick looks. So a lot of what we do, a lot of what I do is working on the quick looks. So pulling the data and then visualizing that in geographic information systems, GIS, ArcGIS, and then working with that data and making it into something visual that we can kind of use, and then I export that into Illustrator, and that's where I put together all of the text that Penny puts together, and all the little icons and visuals, charts that we put together, and then all the cartography is done in there. So I have to think about like the colors, fonts, the design of everything, trying to fit all of this information onto one page. That's probably the biggest challenge of these, especially with Penny, likes to write a lot sometimes. But other than that, if I'm not working on a quick look, I'm thinking about how to make it easier, not just for me, but for everybody else, especially as we expand our team. So just streamlining that process and automation opportunities, more scripts, and creating templates and guides and some of the base maps that we use and some of the geo databases. Try to make some basic shape files and stuff that I tend to use a lot. So just trying to make everything a lot easier for me and for everybody else. That's the bulk of what I do.
And that seems like a key part of this. So at GWSC, we're pretty new. I've been here for 2 years. Mike started this up a year before that. Penny's been on board for about a year, Nick a little bit longer than that, about a year and a half. And so for a long time, everything was new. Every single project was brand new. Penny, Nick, do you feel like you're starting to see some patterns? Are we starting to be able to reuse approaches that we've used in the past?
Yeah, I would say absolutely yes. Yeah, there are still moments where it feels like we're building the airplane as we fly it, which is, I really enjoy being in that kind of a position. But yeah, so like when we get a couple of requests about El Nino, we have some idea already of what previous El Ninos have done in particular regions, or we already have a sense of the most important aspects of El Nino that someone is interested in that they might not be able to articulate in the moment. We've also discovered that analogs are a really effective way of communicating impacts. Like it's hard to understand, a 20% increase in precipitation. But if you can say that, the average winter precipitation in 2050 is going to resemble this storm from 2005 that had these impacts in this place, it's much easier for us to grasp.
Yeah, and for me, it's like workflow, doing the same workflows for some of the same data, like the scripting and automating some of that's going to be a lot easier. And we've found some different ways of visualizing things are more effective than others. So, and getting feedback from our past products and being able to incorporate that in our future and current products.
Well, that seems like a great segue into actually looking at some of the work that Nick and Penny have put together. So if we can pull up our El Nino forecast, let's talk about that a little bit, because making this concrete, I think, will maybe make some of this easier to understand. So this came about because this summer we were actually asked, we had a specific request for information that came in about what is likely to happen with food security in Southeast Asia, given that it's a really big El Nino year. So, in the news, people are talking about El Nino. We sort of assume there's going to be impacts of some kind. And the real question is, well, what does that mean? What's actually happening here? What is El Nino going to affect? And so with that sort of broad outline of a question, I said to Penny, what do we know? What do we know about El Nino and food security in Southeast Asia? What can we bring to this conversation? So I'll start by turning it over to you, Penny, and we'll get Nick's insight on this as well too.
Sure. Yeah, this was a super interesting and also very challenging question to answer, because the region of Southeast Asia is so diverse, both culturally, economically, atmospherically. And so there are patterns to how an El Nino will affect particularly precipitation in this region. but those patterns they vary over space and time. So that same pattern will not affect every country in the same way at the same time, which led to the synthesis of my one sentence is at the very top here. Rice production in every Southeast Asian country will be impacted by too much rain, too little rain, or both in the next 6 months, because I needed to convey that, like, no one is safe, but no one is safe in different ways. So that once I had a sense of what the forecast was going to look like, which happened because I spent a lot of time looking at a 6-month forecast of Southeast Asia, I for the map that you see on the screen, literally just like put a map of Southeast Asia on my iPad, got out my little pen and drew blobs on the region. And I was like, Nick, I need your help to make this legible. And so that was how this map, Nick, I don't know if you want to describe how things went from blobs to beauty.
Well, first, you had identified like this analog of the previous El Nino. So I had created all these extra maps too, panels to kind of, so you can kind of look through visually and kind of identify these blobs that you had drawn in your iPad. And then I was just refined them a little bit from what you had given me. But yeah, it was a interesting challenge to try to show this temporal change of the weather conditions, and then also show the rice production on there. Trying to show raster on raster is always kind of difficult. So usually we had shown like the current conditions were a forecast as the main visual, and then an inset of the previous analog. But in this case, it was a little difficult. So we ended up just having this main visual, just of rice production, and having these blobs on here kind of showing the change in the weather within the forecast. And then
can we take a look at those forecast panels and historic analog panels, which I think will help make the extent of how much simplification you two did a lot clearer, because this is a lot more complicated. What are we looking at here?
So yeah, the historic El Nino ones are the ones in red on the top there. And so these are from September, October, November. So this is from ERA 5 historic data. And this is the precipitation anomaly for this time frame. And then we also have this is from NMME for the forecast. I don't know what that stands for, but
the North American Multi-Model Ensemble. It's a set of initialized climate model runs.
Yeah, and so I pulled the data for these, and then I had to have the same range for precipitation, and then I had to have the same color ramp for all of them. So just to give Penny a quick and easy way to kind of visualize that. And we found that we're going to end up probably doing this a lot. So this is something that we've worked on automating as well.
So Penny, you were looking at these and you saw some patterns, some of which maybe were expected and some were not expected.
Yeah, there are typical patterns that you see in an El Nino, but then as with every other weather phenomenon, there will be exceptions, atypical anomalies. But the one thing that really stood out, and it's coming to bear now that we're a few months out from this quick look, so we can look at ERA 5 data up until now to see whether our predictions were correct, is that Jakarta, so the island on the very bottom of each of these panels, was going to be dry, just stunningly dry. And that was reflected in the El Nino, the very dry Southeast Asia El Nino of 2015. And you can see it in our September to November forecast. So Jakarta along the bottom. And so Penelope, if you'll flip back to the previous slide. So why that is important is because if you look at the island of Jakarta, this southern island on the map, it is an intense rice production region. So of all of the areas that could be hard hit, this one being hardest hit is going to have the biggest impact on rice production in all of Southeast Asia. Indonesia consumes an incredible amount of rice. It also exports an incredible amount of rice. So hitting this region hard is going to have a big impact. And so that was the very first bullet point in the quick look. So up sort of top left-ish corner, there is the bullet point about the high magnitude drought impacts will affect rice production in El Nino. Because this was the most important nugget in this story, it warranted being the very first bullet that any reader would see when they opened up the quick look.
And I wanted to draw out from that also that you spent some time really looking at food security in Southeast Asia. What does that mean? And that it does mean rice for the most part.
Rice makes up an enormous fraction of the average Southeast Asian diet. Rice and either fish, if you are in an island or a coastal region, or pork or other like livestock production proteins. But if you have an issue with rice in the region, then you have an issue with food security writ large. The associated issue is that in previous El Niños, when there has been a decrease in rice production, and you can see in the graph, the previous El Nino 2014 to 2016, it shows a significant drop in rice production. What these countries often did was go to other rice producing nations like India or Pakistan and increase their imports. However, this year, because Pakistan was affected by the previous year's floods, and India is also being severely affected by this year's El Nino, the countries that are producing rice that are experiencing a sudden deficit can't just go to these other rice-producing nations and increase their trade in order to bolster their own supplies.
And that's something that you highlighted down below with the mitigating factors.
Yes. Yeah. So what we also try to do with the quick looks, especially, is explain some of the other factors at play that may affect kind of these like confounding variables that may affect our projections. And that's that, environmental determinism isn't really a thing. There are always systems in place, like institutions or trade or other human infrastructure that can allow us to mitigate these effects from the climate, from weather anomalies, these sorts of things. So that's how the very bottom right mitigating factor was this idea of trade as a piece of that infrastructure to mitigate the effects of changing precipitation.
Can one or both of you talk to us a little bit about that graph that's in the middle here? I'm curious what that's telling us.
No, Penny kind of touched on it real quick about the rice production. So I think you made that right in R or something, and then gave it to me to kind of style to make it match the rest of the quick look. But you can see it's the rice production for those 4 countries. And the red shaded area is highlighting that 2015-16 El Nino and really showing that real steep drop off in rice production for most of the countries there, to try to illustrate that this could potentially also be a big drop off for this El Nino.
Other thoughts about this quick look? Go ahead, Penny.
Well, specifically about this graph, maybe what the graph can't tell us is that there are always, again, confounding variables to data. And there are lots of, papers and news articles about the other things that were going on in 2015, 2016 that may have added to this drop in rice production. The other thing we found was that Indonesia particularly routinely inflates its rice production numbers, even those that they officially report to wider bodies like the Food and Agriculture Organization, in order to make the president feel good about his food self-sustaining policies. So while this graph does communicate some very important information, there are always things going in the background.
And to me, I think that's starts to get at the heart of what we're doing. So we're trying to communicate with folks who are busy. It is not their job to understand anything about how rice production gets reported or not. It's not their job to understand how sea surface temperature causes different kinds of impacts in terms of what precipitation and temperature in the forecast. What they're busy doing other stuff. And so what we're trying to do is do all that synthesis for them to answer the really specific questions that we think they have. And then they're going to look at this really fast. I mean, I could hang out with this and talk about it for at least an hour, if not longer. But we know that that's not the kind of attention that our products are getting. And so we're working really hard, and we're constantly refining them to make sure that people can look at them rapidly and understand what the bottom line is. And I think maybe that's a good segue into the other example that we have to show you before we get into talking, answering questions and what you all want to know. So this is a quick look that came about in a pretty different way. For this quick look, we were actually doing some horizon scanning in the office and looking at what does the historic, the relatively recently short-term weather data for the world look like. And what we were seeing was this really strong band of reduced precipitation throughout sort of South Central Africa, and specifically in the Zambezi River Basin. And we thought, gee, that looks kind of bad. I wonder if anything's happening there. And so I said to Penny, will you take a look at this? I don't know what's happening here, but there's a pretty big weather anomaly that we're right in the middle of. So what's the story here? What's happening? So on to you, Penny.
This was super interesting. It was one of those stories that rolled itself out really easily, which is not often the case. So Zimbabwe in particular was in the midst of significant hydropower blackouts. So Zambia and Zimbabwe share the Kariba Dam, which is highlighted in the middle of this map. And it's one of the biggest hydro production facilities in all of Africa. The issue is, though, because you have two countries who are sharing this river and sharing these water resources in order to generate power in their countries, if you don't have enough rain, you can deplete that reservoir very quickly. And if you don't have alternate sources of energy, then you're having to have rolling blackouts, rolling brownouts in order to conserve power. So Zimbabwe was only turning on the electricity for 4 hours every day. And it was normally between the hours of midnight and 4, because that was when demand was at its lowest, because most people are asleep. And this caused incredible hardship. Manufacturing couldn't run its plants. People couldn't cook their food. Small, like informal business sector, everyone from people who like repair shoes to iron clothes, all of a sudden had to do their work between the hours of midnight and 4. And it caused a lot of protests that were being whipped up by the political opposition, which makes good sense because they were in the process of an election. So the picture at the very bottom right is the current president of Zimbabwe, who ran on a campaign of electrifying the whole country, in universal access 24 hours a day to electricity. He has not delivered on it. And so there were all of these stories of political opposition being like mobilized in order to protest against the standing president who was not making good on his promises. Well, Zimbabwe had another election just a few months ago. And there indeed were a number of protests. Some of them were specifically about water and hydropower. Others were just protests because, you know, it's been a reigning dictatorship for 30 years and people get upset. They long for change. So we rolled this all out in April, and the Zimbabwean elections were in August. And it was very convenient because in July, the Zimbabwean government announced the end to the blackouts that were being driven by the lack of precipitation in the low reservoir. But subsequent reports were saying that those announcements were merely announcements. There actually were no real like substantive changes in the amount of electricity being distributed or the time that it was being sent out to people. And so the incumbent president did win the election again, but his like international observers are saying that this is a highly contested, like there are a lot of irregularities with this election. And so it was super interesting to see how water effects on the ground were being mobilized into this political sphere, and like this lack of being able to fulfill these promises is still playing out in the way Zimbabwe's election is being viewed today.
I think this is a super fascinating one because it's pretty clear that water didn't cause this, but it plays in really striking ways. It did play a real role in how things unfolded. Is that how you interpret this, Penny?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's not as if the drought caused existing political tensions in the country. It's just that the drought caused impacts that inflamed and exacerbated existing political tensions and gave the opposition a hook that they could use to mobilize people to stage protests or vote for the vote for them as the opposition.
Nick, can you talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing in this quick look here? The map and the graph.
Yeah, so because we wanted to focus on the Kariba Reservoir, it made more sense to highlight the watershed itself. So here we have the watershed showing the precipitation anomaly for March, and that's when we had noticed that severe precip deficit. So we highlight that there, and then the chart is showing the surface area of the reservoir, and we are using the analog of 2019 when it was at its lowest point, and 2022 is actually showing about the same low point, and that actually sparked fuel protests at the same time. So this data came from the Army Corps of Engineers. It's called MOGWI, which they use MODIS satellite data to give us this. I think it's like a 6-day average of the surface area. So we use that to kind of show that because that the dry season is looking to be hotter than normal for this year, that it could be even potentially lower than it was in 2019 when there was fuel protests.
And so, you know, what Nick's really done here is we've backed our way out of the problem of not having a hydrologic model for this basin. Instead, what we're looking at are, you know, the key drivers, trends in the variable of interest, the key drivers, so how much is it raining across the whole watershed, and trends in the variable of interest, which is how much water is in that reservoir. And we certainly can't say with some kind of an engineering precision, it's this low, this is what the outlook for energy production is. You wouldn't use a product like this to manage your reservoir differently. You use a product like this to say, whoa, we should be paying attention to what's going on here, because they have a really big problem that they're not going to be able to engineer their way out of.
Yeah, it's a super interesting example of how so much of what we're looking at when it comes to water is not an engineering problem. It's a social problem, political problem. It's, you know, institutions and agreements and all of that very human soft stuff that allows us to share a variable resource.
So I want to transition us into some Q&A now. So the first question, thanks, Don, hi. But the first question, yes, we do have a lot of these available on our website right now, and we're working on updating that as we speak. So you Google Global Water Security Center, you'll find us. We're also ua-gwsc.org. So yes, you can find these. And we would love to share them and circulate them. We will at some point have a newsletter, but we're not quite there yet. So then, you know, some other questions for the group. Hobson wanted to know, what's the most challenging part of this process? What do you think, Penny?
Oh, finding the boundaries, not the regional boundaries, like, oh, this is where the border ends, but where does the research stop? Because honest to goodness, these could be PhD dissertations. But it has to be the most important elements, the most like salient bits of information packed into this small space. So knowing, and oftentimes it's Kate who pulls me from the rabbit hole, who answers that question for me. But yeah, I think it's knowing when to call it. We have enough.
What about you, Nick? What do you think the most challenging part is?
For me, it's probably getting the data and then getting it into a way that I can actually use it and it's useful for me. And then another thing is probably fitting all of this onto one page can be a pain, especially if the countries are like a weird shape or something like that. I have to work with that as well. So working with negative space and just trying to figure out how to fit everything together and make it actually appealing.
And I just want to highlight here that Nick, who does this professionally, still thinks that getting and synthesizing and putting the data together is one of the most challenging parts. So I have a lot of empathy for our users because I don't think, I am not throwing any shade when I say that decision makers don't and can't use this information because it's legitimately hard. Many of us have spent like a lot of years in school getting up to speed on them, and there's no possible way to think about what's happening, in the world in depth. All of it. You need organizations like this with this kind of broad set of expertise and insight, I think, to pull these together. We had another question about the breadth of our work, which I think is super nice. So I'll talk about a little bit, and then I'm going to pass it back again to Penny and Nick. So our focus is really international. Because the Department of Defense is focused internationally, that's where sort of our clients are interested in, and that's where we work. And a lot of similar work like this is happening within US agencies domestically. And so we're really trying to fill a niche that isn't being filled right now. So really complementing the kinds of work that other folks are doing. But we are starting to work on projects in a variety of places and projects that look different from these quick looks that are really designed to be basically a single page. So Penny, do you want to talk about maybe some of the other, like what have we worked on that you've been super excited about particularly?
Yeah, so there are these temporal differences. So we've gotten a couple of questions about, what is my region of interest going to look like in 2050 or 2075, which requires looking at a lot of historical data, a lot of like future climate data, and figuring out, what's the most important, what's the most salient piece of information about this region in 2050. Or, what is going to happen in my region of interest in 3 months? I would like to know what El Nino is going to do to rice next month, which requires a completely different approach and framework, because what someone cares about in 3 months is not the same as what someone's going to care about in 25 years. And then there is a topic breadth as well. So we've looked at food security, we've looked at unrest. We've also looked at things that are kind of water adjacent, like what will temperatures and wildfires do to water quality, and how might that affect, populations downstream. One of our latest is like illicit agriculture. What does drought do for people who might consider growing coca instead of corn? So there's like a topic breadth as well.
Yeah, I have to say, I have in previous lives spent lots of time thinking about global trends in agriculture and the different sources of data about agriculture. And let me tell you, none of those people are tracking opium and coca. We don't have great historic data on this. There are obviously some organizations that are doing that. So it's really been a blast to start pulling that information into the kind of work we do. Like, how much irrigation water is going to opium instead of wheat in Afghanistan? Is actually a pretty important question to know the answer to, and does not come straight out of the agricultural statistics. Nick, how about you? What have been some of your favorite quick looks or other products that we've worked on?
Especially early on when we were trying to develop this process and figure out what data we're going to need and what type of analysis we're going to do. Did like all types of fun stuff, and with the talking about the hunger stones in Europe. So looking at the drought there, the farmer herder conflicts in Kenya. So those are fun ones. And just some basic overview ones like the one on Haiti, talking about some of the past disasters. And we did do one US one about the Imperial Valley and their lettuce production. And that a lot of these were kind of self-directed, and or we hear someone say something and maybe it doesn't sound so right. So we want to investigate that a little further and see what we can say about that. But yeah, I think it's great having, it's a new topic, I think, every single time. So we're never going to run out of work. So that's for sure.
So Nick, you mentioned a country brief. We did work on one for Haiti, and that had a similar approach as our quick looks. It was really a single page, but we have been thinking about deeper dives into specific countries. Penny, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the one that we're working on presently is in Albania, which for a small country has a remarkable amount of temperature and precipitation variation, and variation in how it gets its water and whether or not it's treated. And so the question was a climate question, like what are the risks coming for this region by around 2050? And so with the quick looks, we focus so much on getting everything down to one bullet. What is the most important thing? And then with the insight brief that we're working on now, we have more like a page per impact or topic, which sounds like a lot, but still comes with that same difficulty of how do you boil it down, even if we just have one page on hydropower or one page on health related to water filtration and water supply. How do we boil that down to one page, and how do we make all of these impacts flow together? We're a water organization, but how do we make all of this flow together in a way that is coherent, so that someone who's just stepping in, who may know Albania a little bit but doesn't know the water situation, how do they read this from top to bottom and come away feeling like they have the information they need?
So we also have a question about being wrong, which is a real risk when you're looking at forecast data, not just for the weather, but when you're trying to think about what might happen here. So what do we do? You want to talk a little bit about when we've been wrong?
Sure. I think the biggest one was the India forecast. What was El Nino going to do to India's monsoon season? And so the news was telling us that the government was very concerned about a low monsoon. And so we took that into consideration, and then we looked at our own forecast, and our forecast said something different. Our forecast said, you know what, the monsoon is going to be pretty normal. We've got El Nino, we've got the Indian Ocean dipole. You don't need to know about those things, but know that they're working together to make a pretty normal monsoon. Well, we were very wrong. And it was the one time where we were like, hey, things aren't going to be that bad. We often have to tell people really bad news. We joke about how bad news is really good news for us. And this one, we were saying it's not going to be so bad. And then what happened in India really was that an absolute deluge hit the country in the first month, and then it was subsequently dry as predicted. So the country got a low monsoon, and it's really difficult after having been a high-performing academic who often gets to do things over and over again until they're right, to be told, no, you got this one wrong. And So we're coming up, we have to come up with a whole system, because there are a number of ways that we could be wrong in the future. And so for our own accountability and to make sure that our clients get the information that they need, we're developing a system to look back at our previous projections and our previous clients and have like accountability measures in place.
Yeah, because I think that's actually something that I ended up getting really excited about when we started looking at this, because there's lots of very different reasons that you can be wrong. And they have different implications. So, one of the things that Penny is talking about here is that the forecast was actually wrong. The forecasts that we were looking at said there's not going to be a lot going on. That's it, that's a very different problem than interpreting the forecast wrong. If the models are simply saying, they're running and they're not always right. We know that there's imperfections, that they're not always skillful. But I think also, and this has been something that's been really interesting to us, is that the kinds of water shocks that tend to really matter, a real dry period during the monsoon or really heavy rains, it's not clear if and when you can pull that sort of information out of these midterm seasonal forecasts. The seasonal forecasts, the way that they're delivered, the way they're sort of meant to be interpreted, is with a monthly average value. And so if you have a bucket of rain on the first of the month and then it doesn't rain at all for the rest of the month, you might end up with an average value that actually looks pretty normal. And in fact, that's what we saw with this. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's what ended up happening.
And so we're actually working with some of the folks that develop these to see if we can provide some use cases so that they can actually go looking into the data to see, where are there windows of opportunity? Where are there places where we can pull that apart and say, oh, this isn't like an even average, this is a big spike or a dry period? Because understanding those more extreme events, it turns out to be really important for the kind of work that we're doing. And so that's been, it's not that nobody had ever thought to do that before. We're not sort of uncovering new science, but I think we're helping to provide some really good use cases that say, hey, if you can tell us about the monsoon in India, and like these particular characteristics, that will help us better understand impacts on rice production. And that's important for food security. And so it's really, I find it really rewarding to be able to have that back and forth with the science about like, hey, you want to know this particular thing that's actually like pretty cool science to figure out the answer to. I think there's like a really nice queue up of a couple of questions together to wrap us up for today. This has been a great conversation, which is, how do you hope that your work and outputs will evolve? Do you have experience with business? Are they interested to know about risk to the supply chain? So I'm going to provide an answer, then I'm going to turn it over to Penny and Nick to close out with how they're hoping to see some evolution with this. What I'll say is that really we're working for DoD right now. As our team grows and we get more experience and we get a little better at doing this, I would love the opportunity to work with more people, because I think these issues, maybe not the real nuances of some of them, but the approach and the bigger picture is super interesting and really important for businesses, for NGOs, for other parts of government. And I really believe that we can provide a service and help these different entities make better decisions by integrating this kind of information into what they do. And so that for me is like looking towards the future, one of the most exciting things that we could be doing. And so then I'll say, Nick, what do you think? What are you excited about as you think about the evolution of our products and what we're working on?
Yeah, I see. Someone also asked about machine learning. So I think incorporating more science and technology into what we're working with, and we're hiring, a few more data scientists. So seeing what they can, provide for us too, and new perspectives on how we can make these reports better. And coming from the intelligence community, I would love to see these have greater reach to even like that level of like a lower level analyst, not just these decision makers, but folks that are creating these reports that end up filtering out to other countries and other intelligence agencies and the military and stuff like that too. So yeah, just greater reach and more science and technology.
Well, not unrelated to those two, I thought I might have heard a rumor that you were interested in story maps and more interactive ways to think about some of the cartography that you're doing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that I don't have a lot of experience working in, and things like I never think about social media, for example. So creating things that we can provide for the general public that can generate interest and awareness for some of these topics. Yeah.
Great. Penny, what about you? How are you interested in seeing GWSC evolve?
Ooh, I think right now, because we're still, building the airplane as we fly it, we are focusing on quick looks, really tight, punchy, salient bits of like products. And it will be interesting to see how we evolve as the team gets more of these under their belts. Like, how do we convey more nuance in that same kind of really pithy delivery system? Because like even we were talking earlier, there's always something going on in the background. And it's not as if we can explain all of that in one quick look. Like that's, my own personal rabbit hole, but finding ways to like imbue more nuance in these really punchy products, because I think because we're getting straight into the eyes of decision makers and like people who are in the halls of power, for like a lack of a better term, weaving that nuance in, I think would be really, really powerful.
I love it. I feel like that's exactly the right note to end on. So I will just close us out by saying thank you for attending our webinar. We really appreciate your taking the time to be here, interacting with us, asking great questions. And you'll notice when you exit the webinar, you'll get a survey that pops up in your web browser. If you're able to answer those questions, we would really appreciate it. That would be really helpful for us, and it'll help inform our future programming. We do not see who actually provides those, so you are welcome to be as frank as you would like. Again, if you want any more information about the Global Water Security Center, you can find us online at ua-gwsc.org. We will also put this recording online. You'll be able to access it through our website. If you have questions for us, if you want to reach out to us about products that you're interested in, the easiest way right now is actually just to send us an email. Those are all on our website. You can also get me. I'm Kay Brauman at ua.edu. Same for Penny and Nick, first initial, last name. And we really appreciate your taking the time to be here, your great questions. And we hope that we see you again at our next webinar. Thank you so very much.